Throughout history, free thinkers have outraged the religious with their wacky ideas about the virtues of free speech, reason, and of course, eating babies. Now, God is dying, and it's time to dispose of his remains. From the pits of hell, Satan sends two puppets of the imperialist West and the Zionist Jews against God, Islam, and tiny kittens to bring you their propaganda and conspire for a new world order. This is Secular Jihadists for a Muslim Enlightenment with Ali Rizvi and Armin Navabi.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Secular Jihadists for a Muslim Enlightenment. My name is Ali Rizvi. Armin Navabi is still out right now. He's still on vacation, and he's going to be returning for the next episode. He'll be coming back. But right now, it's just me, and I have a very special guest with me today, and I'm very excited to speak to her. Janice Selbie is here. She is a registered counselor in Canada. She divorced her own religion after 40 years. She was an evangelical fundamentalist Christian, and around the same time, she also divorced her husband, who was a pastor, after nearly 2 decades together. And this was obviously devastating. And after this, she went back to school, and she became a professional counselor. And right now, she has a personal interest in religious trauma syndrome. And this is what drove her to develop the online divorcing religion workshop, and that's divorcingreligion.com. And she also put together, this is really amazing, the kind of things that you've done for this, Janice, is she put together the conference on religious trauma. That's CORT2020.com. Please go and check it out. This is a special conference that focuses on religious trauma. It's being held in April in Vancouver, British Columbia, in Canada. It also features Yasmin Mohammed, a recent guest on this podcast, and one of the founding the co-hosts of this podcast. And she has a book out called Unveiled that many of you have read and praised. So she's working with them as well. And as you know, Yasmin runs Free Hearts, Free Minds. So this is really going to be one of the first conferences of its kind. That is going to focus on something and one of the reasons we have Janice here is because this is something that we hear a lot about from ex-Muslims. Ex-Muslims face religious trauma around the world. We've had many of them here on this podcast in a way that is still very, very unfortunate. It's very life-threatening as well. So many of them are doing this at risk to their lives. So we're going to go ahead and start. Janice, welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy you're here. I'm so glad to speak to you.
Thank you. I'm tickled to be here. It's just wonderful. Thanks for having me on.
You're tickled to be here. And speaking of tickled, I didn't mention this, but I'm going to. You're also a comedian, and I saw some of the stuff you had on YouTube, and it was pretty funny. And that's, I think, I would like to touch at some point on that, on the use of humor in overcoming some of these things.
It's therapeutic.
All kinds of things that I'm really into. So we'd love to talk about it.
Yeah.
So let's start with, so you have a pretty compelling life story. It's a very sad life story as well. So you're saying it was about 7 years ago that you divorced religion, and then that also led to the divorce, your marriage, the end of your marriage. Mm-hmm. So can you talk about how you grew up, what your life was like, and your journey, how it led to where you are today?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Canadian, and I grew up in the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia, very beautiful place to call home. And my parents got saved, so they became Christians before they had any children. And so I was born into a house that was basically Pentecostal, so very evangelical, speaking in tongues, church a couple of times every weekend. And we certainly had rules in the house about what programs we could watch. We did have a TV, but what programs we could watch, the clothing we wore. Like my parents, as a daughter, I was expected to be fairly modest. And I certainly was raised to believe that the Bible, everything in the Bible was true. It wasn't mythology. They weren't just stories. This was the literal truth. Every word was true. And so I believed it because this is what my parents that I trusted, this is what they believed, and this is what they taught. And my friends were church friends, and that's also what they believed. And so I went to public school, but definitely never really fit in there. Just because, well, mostly I was worried that my classmates were going to hell, and I would try and witness to them. I cared very much for their eternal lives, and that does not make you really popular at parties, just saying. People find that pretty
I can
uncomfortable.
imagine.
Walking around with a big Bible tucked into your arm there. So that was really, my schooling was like that. And then in my late teens, I wandered away, had some freedom, checked out what life was like a little bit on the outside, but still, never went like whole hog. But then eventually in my early 20s, I had a reconversion, born again experience of my own. And I never looked back from that point. Then I became even much more fundamentalist than my parents were, and only saw the world in very black and white terms. My relationship with my siblings, who had walked away from the faith long ago, became quite shallow, almost non-existent. And then I married a fellow, our pastor introduced us, and this man was what we call an apologist. So he really spent a lot of time studying and was trying to always ready to give a reason for his faith, for why he believed. And so I really admired that. And he's a good man, a kind man. And so we married and moved to a small southern Alberta town where he went to Bible college. And my job, of course, was to be the keeper of the home. So we had 2 small daughters at that time. And I began homeschooling them. The longer we were on the campus, the narrower my views became and my world became. It was quite a conservative campus. And then I would see people coming into the store, like the grocery store. So it was mostly a Christian town. It really only existed because of the Bible college. And I'd see these women coming in, and they would be wearing head coverings. And for non-Muslim women to be wearing head coverings, I mean, you're basically thinking they're Amish, right? And so at one point, I went up and asked one of them about it, and she explained to me that it was in the Bible, in the New Testament. And so I went home and was looking through my Bible again and thought, you know what, that is in the New Testament, and I don't see that we're excused from that. So I think maybe everybody else is just not being very obedient to Scripture. And I really was drawn to rules. Rules were my comfort zone because I grew up in a home with lots of rules. And my dad also is quite volatile emotionally and not really healthy mentally. And so we had to learn rules from quite early on to avoid punishment. So I started exploring the ideas that this lady was talking about, submission, headship, more and more rules. And I just felt so comfortable and felt so certain this is the true way that God wants us to live. And so I asked my husband, who's no longer my husband, by the way, I asked him if he minded if I would start wearing a head covering. And we had already given up TV by this point. And he thought it was fine because it was scriptural. And at that point, I just was making my circle ever smaller for the people that I allowed into my life. And no one was forcing me to do it. Certainly my husband, he was a pretty relaxed fellow. He was not the one insisting on these behaviors. It was rooted in my own unhealthy childhood. So yeah, that got me going down the rabbit hole of fundamentalism. And then of course, homeschooling, that's also very reinforced because a lot of the homeschool community are fundamentalist Christians. So almost trying to outdo each other with their holiness and with how closely they can stick to the rules of the Bible and whose children can learn and recite the most Bible verses and, that sort of thing.
Yeah. That sounds so familiar. I mean, especially most obviously the head covering. It's really interesting because you're absolutely right. I mean, the head covering is prescribed in the New Testament. What's interesting is in the Quran, it's not as obvious. Like, it doesn't actually say it as explicitly as it does in the New Testament. There's a direction to Muhammad's wives that they should cover themselves and pull their cloaks over their bosom and so on.
Right.
Their head covers over their bosom, and it's I think it's in Surah 33, but it is in the Hadith, in this other sort of collection of traditions of the Prophet, and that's where it comes from. But so it is interesting that, I mean, it's not just a head covering, but everything else you're talking about, the fundamentalism, taking the scriptural word literally. This is something I think a lot of people in the Muslim community and the ex-Muslim community will probably relate to.
And I was very sincere, deeply sincere about it. I absolutely believed it. I had tremendous concern for my fellow humans whom I thought were destined for hell. So it definitely was not just some sort of act. This was, and by then I'd been a Christian pretty much my whole life because I was raised in it from the time I was in the cradle. So to me, God and Jesus were very real. I could not imagine going through an hour, let alone a day, without praying or praising or encouraging others, admonishing people with scripture. That was totally enmeshed with my identity.
Yeah. Have you spoken to Nate Phelps and Megan Roper Phelps?
Nate is another speaker at our conference, at the conference on religious trauma.
This is amazing. Okay, I'm definitely going to come down here.
Yay!
Because I love Nate. I've spoken at his conference a couple of times. And for those who don't know what I'm talking about, Nate Phelps is a son of Fred Phelps, who was the founder of church, so a fundamentalist organization. But I've heard him speak actually very similarly about his childhood, and he is probably one of the most compelling speakers I know when he tells the stories of what he went through as a child and the whole family and all of the abuse. It's absolutely heartbreaking. So I got to say this again, CORT2020.com. Go there. Yasmin Mohammed, Nate Phelps, Janice, you're all going to be speakers there. I mean, this is great. So you grew up, you became born again, you became even more fundamentalist than your parents. You said, before we go on to how you left all this, you said that your siblings left the faith long ago.
Yes.
So why did that happen? How did your parents react to it when they did it?
Well, I'm the youngest of 4 children, so 3 of us biologically born, and then my sister, I call her my sister. She's First Nations, Indigenous in Canada, and she was part of the 60s scoop. So evangelical white families were encouraged to adopt and foster First Nations children who were essentially kidnapped, ripped off of reserves, right, and placed in these families. So that's how my sister came to live with us, the 60s scoop. So I don't know that she ever believed any of it. I can't even imagine the trauma that she experienced. But my brothers certainly walked away in their teens. And being the youngest, I saw the pain, the tremendous pain that caused my parents. And for sure, that had a role in me determining that I would not do that. I would not cause my parents that kind of pain. I would be the golden child. So that's kind of how that happened. And then sorry.
Oh no, I was saying, did your parents, did their relationship with your siblings survive, or did they just become distant after that?
My mom has generally been able to maintain a fairly loose grip on her faith. I mean, I remember her saying to me through the years, eat the meat and spit out the bones. Like she's not the diehard fundy that my dad is. So we always felt that my father's love was conditional. And that is true. And he would deny that and say it's not true. But it certainly is true. So we know that, and we still all have relationships with our parents, but they are a lot more shallow than they would be if we were still part of them. You can see I have Steve, my cat, just.
Oh, that's your cat. So yeah,
Sorry.
for those for those who are listening to this on audio only and you're not watching the video, Janice's cat just came in. It's adorable. Okay, so you become a born again Christian, and then you get married, and you have children, and you're wearing the head cover, and you're sort of isolating yourself from the community in a way, a narrower circle. What causes it? Was it a gradual process that caused you to leave, or was it sort of one moment, one incident? How did that transition happen?
Yeah, great question. It was many things, one on top of another. So part of the reason that I was so eager to adopt the head covering was because my marriage was difficult. Even though my husband, my ex-husband, he is a good person, and actually we have retained quite a beautiful friendship, but our relationship was difficult. We're very, very different people. And so I felt that wearing the head covering would be a better reminder to me that my place was to submit to my husband, because he's more of a meek type of person, a gentle and quiet person, and I'm more outgoing. And so we always had this tension and this strain in our marriage. And I chafed at the thought that even though we were both adults, we had to do everything he wanted, because scripturally that's how it goes. The man is the head of the house and the woman is there to serve and to train up her children, and that's it. And so that definitely weighed on me throughout our marriage. And then we had a couple of years that were just very rough. He was pastoring and it wasn't going well. We were having a lot of friction, a lot of trouble with the church. My parents split up after 43 years, and that was shocking. And then my nephew actually killed somebody, my young nephew in his teens. And so that then there was the court case, and so it was a lot of trauma. And then our youngest daughter was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness. And even though we're in Canada, it was still very expensive to pay for what she needed, and that played a role in us then going bankrupt. So all those things happened in about a 2-year span without even time to breathe and catch our breath. And I really was so disappointed. We were not being supported by our church family at all. There was like just radio silence. They were not there for us. It was very painful. And that's when I started to think, I've bet on the wrong horse. This is not right. I don't know anyone else who has tried to live as closely to the scripture as I have, and who is just having nothing but a terrible time, every calamity. Other than Job, I guess, but it really was so painful. And it just made me think, no, if this is how God rewards his faithful, I don't want part of it. But it was such a terrifying thought for someone who had never had doubts before. And I remember one day my husband was at work and the children were at school, and I snuck across the street. There is a used bookstore there, and there was a closet in the back where they kept the books that not everybody was supposed to see. There was a curtain in front, and it said occult books, occult and alternative religions. And I thought, I'm going to go in there and see what happens. And I was so scared to go in there, and I pulled back the curtain, and I fully expected lightning, and there was no lightning. But my heart was pounding, and I'm looking around for some kind of book that can teach me something, but not immediately send me to hell. So I finally found a book that seemed kind of like a textbook looking at some different religions. And I asked the cashier for a brown paper bag because I was so worried that anybody might see me walking out with this book. And I ran home with it across the street, and I put it in the safest place I could think of, which was my underwear drawer, because I knew God would not even look in there. And that book stayed in there.
Which book was this? Which book was it?
I think it was called In the Path of the Masters, and it was about Buddhism and Islam and Confucianism and Christianity. And it was very dry. It was a very dry book, but I went through it a little bit at a time, and it kind of gave me more courage. And it made me think, okay, smarter people than me have questioned this whole thing. And then eventually I built up my courage and went back and started looking at other books, and then started wearing shorter skirts and started wearing makeup, and boy, TV and cable came back, and next thing you know, I'm getting tattoos, and my kids had a front row seat to that whole thing.
The head covering was gone.
Gone with the wind. Yeah. Buried. I buried one of them because it's important to have a releasing ceremony when you let go of things like that.
That's so it's interesting. I have in my book, I wrote about an experience that I had with my aunt, my mother's sister, and I was around 5 years old when her first daughter, who was 3, died of childhood leukemia. So this is in the late 70s, early 80s, when now childhood leukemia, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, it's pretty much curable. At that time, it wasn't, and so her daughter died of it. And so a year later, and she was obviously devastated. Yeah. A year later, she had another daughter, and then her daughter, at the same age, at the age of 3, was diagnosed with the same illness. No. And she also died.
Oh my goodness!
So I would. Sorry. I think you froze for a second. Okay, no, you're back.
Yeah, I can hear you, and I heard your story. That is just devastating.
Yeah. So it was terrible, and I mean, obviously the whole family was very involved in this because she was my first cousin, and I at that time I think when I was the first one, my cousin was dying at the time. I was in the room. The whole family was in the room. She was at home, and so I remember asking my father, and I wrote about this in the book. I asked him, I was like, what's happening? And cancer death, it's just as painful for a child as it is for an adult. It doesn't discriminate based on age. And so we're watching this, and it's devastating. I never forgot that. And I think I was only 5 and asked my father, said, what's happening? He said, well, she's going back to God. God's taking her back to stay with him. And then I saw my aunt and my mom they're reading from the Quran, and they had crying, and so I said, what are they doing? And then he said, well, they're praying, and they're just asking God not to take her away. And then I'm watching this child in agony, and I'm thinking, this is like a tug of war where we want to keep her, and on the other side there's a sadist. And that was my introduction, my first real introduction to God. Now, I grew up in a Muslim family. Pakistani Muslim family growing up in Saudi Arabia. Okay, so I was surrounded by Islam. This event happened in England, so my aunt lived in England, and we were there for just a little bit while this was going on. And that was kind of my introduction to skepticism. And as I grew older, this is something, that part of it I could never make sense of. But when I was writing the book, I talked to my aunt, and I told her that I was putting this story in the book, and how this was a major sort of catalyst, and it initiated me into skepticism. Now with her, it did the opposite. Yeah. It turned her. Yeah. When she had that night, I really tried to understand. I really respect her for a variety of reasons. I mean, she was a really, really brilliant woman, and we always had these interesting conversations. She recently died, unfortunately, too. But for her, what it did was it made her even more faithful. Mm-hmm. She became just a devoutly religious. I think she had this hope that she would meet her daughters again in the afterlife. But it was so strange to me that the same incident of something so devastating, that devastating loss, would mean something completely different to me and her. And she looked at it as a test. And
Right.
I'm wondering if that, when you were going through this, and when you go through a tough time, it is a really difficult test. But what we're taught when we're indoctrinated into religion is
Mhm.
that, well, if you go through a rough time, this is a test from God. It's a test of your faith. Did you ever think that? And when you were going and buying this book in the brown paperback, did you ever feel that you might be failing the test, or you should stick it out for a little bit longer?
Right. Yeah, for sure. When during that really troubling couple of years when so many traumas were befalling our family, the first two or three things, uh, I thought, okay, well, maybe or it's a test or God is refining me. But then as more and more came, and finally then with my daughter receiving this diagnosis, um, I just it that is what I needed to break through my cognitive dissonance, right? So
Mhm.
I had all of my identity was enmeshed with my religious beliefs. So to let go of it uh, was terrifying. It was embarrassing. I mean, there were people that I had led to Jesus, right? And
Right.
I had given my time, I had given my money, I hadn't gone to university. I had put everything on hold, so to speak, for this religion, and believed that it was all for such a divine purpose. So when I had the realization that that's just not the case, and everything didn't fall away at once. Like I didn't then automatically become an atheist. I did what a lot of fundamentalist Christians do when they leave. They either first they become kind of progressive, where they're saying, okay, well, God doesn't really hate gay people, and maybe I won't go to that church where he hates all the gay
Yeah.
people. I'll go to this other church,
Everything's metaphorical, and
right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
then
yeah.
I moved from that to New Age, and well, let's look at Buddhism, and I grew dreadlocks. Like I say, I got my tattoos.
Yeah.
Hanging out with the whole vegan crowd, doing the yoga, doing the hot yoga, and it was all just steps on my journey. And then
Mhm.
eventually I got to a point where I just didn't need any of it. And and that was hard too, because part of my identity had been that I was a spiritual person. And even when I wasn't a Christian anymore, I still, pardon me, thought of myself as a spiritual person.
Right.
Um, and then when I didn't have that, and then I was no longer married anymore either. So all these bits of my identity, being knocked off all along the way.
This is so that's interesting. So you had, when the shirts got the skirts got shorter and the TV came back and the head covering went. How was so this was, it seems like it was a step by step process. And how was your husband at the time processing this, or were
Right.
you already divorced by this point?
Um, so our marriage had definitely been on shaky ground for probably at least 5 years
Yeah.
leading up to all that. And for him, a really big deal was when his dream of being in ministry, his dream of being a pastor did not work out. That was the death of a dream, it was so shattering for him.
Hmm.
Um, and that really added his depression, added a lot to the difficulty. And then when our daughter was diagnosed too, we're just like in tatters, just kind of hanging on there. So finally, when it came to the point that we were going to separate, and it was heartbreaking because we both did still love each other, uh,
Hmm.
but we knew, and so I had left. I was embracing the new age stuff. He wasn't really embracing anything. He wasn't sure what he thought. He wasn't ready to throw in the towel on religion, but he wasn't attending. services or
Right.
anything at that point. But we were kind of going in different directions. And then we walked through our divorce slowly. We weren't in a big hurry to do it. And we wanted to be as gentle with one another as possible. And we just cared very much for our daughters who were in their teens at that time. And I wouldn't change it. It's the friendship that we have now is such a genuine friendship because we're not friends because we have to be friends. We're friends because we choose to be friends. And now he is quite secular himself as well, but he comes and participates when my partner and I do family dinners. He comes over and he's a part of it. And it's just, I'm extremely fortunate.
No, that sounds wonderful. I'm so happy that things, they kind of turn. It's interesting when you were, you were going through this, you were struggling through this time, and I guess it wasn't just a church community. It's like, what is this? What God is doing? Is this what Jesus is doing? And then you leave it all, and suddenly things seem to start working out.
Yeah, so my life does not look anything like I pictured. I would never. I actually would have thought that I would have died before I would have relinquished my faith. And there's this Christian book called Fox's Book of Martyrs, really depressing book, looking at all through the ages Christians who were martyred for their faith. Yeah. I loved that book. I read that book to my children. Like I was doing, ready to do drills with them. Okay, what do you do if you're in a store and a man comes in with a gun and he's going to shoot you? If he asks if you're a Christian, you have to say yes, even if it means he's going to shoot you, then you're just going to go to heaven. Like, this is how totally wacko I was, how totally fundamentalist and
it sounds so familiar.
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds so. This I can bet so many people now, so much of our audience, the ex-Muslim community, the secular Muslim community, just kind of listening and relating to everything that you're saying. So you finish, and then then what you do is you decide to go back to school, right? And you've had this sort of incredible experience and this incredible journey, and you come out and you decide, okay, I'm going to go back to school, and you're going to study and become a counselor. Mm-hmm. And you're registered. I read about you on Psychology Today. I mean, you're on there as a counselor who works with people who have been through experiences like yourself. What made you decide to go into this field?
I have always been drawn to psychology, and I've always been very much a people person and a lover of stories. I love listening to other people's stories. And I think growing up in a home with a decidedly unhealthy parent gave me some really incredible skills. I can pick up on people's emotions very, very quickly. I can help to diffuse situations fairly quickly. And I want to know what's hurting people. I want to know how can I help. So it made sense for me to choose counseling. Now, at that time, when I deconverted or deconstructed, however you like to say, I didn't know anyone else like me. I didn't know anyone who had believed as devoutly for as long as I did and had walked away from it. So I felt extremely alone, very isolated. I'd sit at the computer and I wouldn't even know what to type in. Like, tears would be streaming down my face, and I'd be typing in, I think I'm not a Christian anymore, or I lost my faith. But there weren't podcasts. There was very little like that. Eventually, I found Marlene Winnell. Do you know who Dr. Winnell is? She wrote an important book. Yeah, she wrote, you're going to know about her. She wrote a book called Leaving the Fold. And
I've heard of the book.
Yes. Yeah, she's also she's one of our keynote speakers. And her book has been such an essential help to so many people who have left fundamentalist religions of all stripes, not just Christianity. So I found Marlene, I saw some video clips. She was on CNN and something else. And then I saw that she does retreats in California. And I thought, I think I better go and interact with this lady. And she was so helpful to me, and just learning, connecting with other people who had been through similar things. And then now I found suddenly I had these words. So all along I had been doing research and taking notes and trying to sort out exactly what had happened to me, and psychologically, how had I fallen prey to this, and how could I protect myself against it happening again. And then I read Leaving the Fold and started interacting with Marlene, and I've never looked back. And that I knew from then on that this working with people who are in recovery from religious trauma was what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. And so I think it's so sorely needed. I know that it feels like there would be a lot of services like this out there, but there aren't enough. In a lot of cases, what happens is that for the longest, I've been working with people who've left Islam for over a decade now, and a lot of times they would write to me. There are some support groups for them. They would go, like ex-Muslims in North America is one where they would go in and they can meet other like-minded people. So there's in a way it's kind of group therapy. Everybody shares their stories.
Mm-hmm.
Or the Muslimish is another group like that. But really the first group that was I think that, and I should mention Mariam Namazi and the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain really kind of started it all. A lot of people used to go there, and just online forums. The internet and social media did wonders for this.
Yes.
Did wonders for it.
Yeah, very helpful.
But the first organization I think that I came across that did this, there are a couple of them. One is Free Hearts, Free Minds. That's the one with that Yasmin Muhammad works with. Jimmy Bangash, who's also really good friend, who's been here on this podcast several times. He's the gay ex-Muslim, the British Pakistani gay ex-Muslim, and also Imtiaz Shams is doing. He has a group in the UK called Faith to Faithless.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and they also do this kind of work. But just in terms of having registered counselors and therapists to help people, to guide people through this, is just something that I think is so sorely needed right now.
I also would direct your listeners and your watchers to Recovering From recoveringfromreligion.org. Right. And they also, a subsidiary of that is Secular Therapy and Secular Therapists, and they're part of hosting our conference there, the Secular Therapy Project. But recoveringfromreligion.org, and people from all different backgrounds, including Islam, and they can get free help there and lots of resources.
Mm-hmm. So when you started this therapy, initially what kind of patients did you get? And was there a lot of demand for it from the get-go, or is it something that you had to built up sort of slowly?
I wasn't, so initially my therapy, I was doing some couple therapy, working with couples, but also I was just seeing singles, anybody who felt like they needed a counselor, and religion didn't factor into it. But I definitely started to see a pattern. Had a lot of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who ended up coming to me. And of course, they're a group that really struggles. There's a lot of shunning if you leave the JW faith, and it's very heartbreaking. And then it wasn't until last year when I developed my online workshop, the Divorcing Religion workshop. And since I started doing that, I've had people come through who were, former Orthodox Jews, former Catholics, ex-priests, this type of thing, and a lot of former independent fundamentalist Baptists. So just there's a whole bunch of people out there who are really hurting. And so I also really direct people to different podcasts because they can be such a help to hear other people's stories and hear about people who've made it, just to help you know you're not alone. Like you said, the internet has been tremendous for this.
Yeah. And so how does it, what do you find is because I would think, and just having been through this somewhat myself, although I didn't come from a fundamentalist background, and I've quoted Phil Zuckerman, who has been a guest on this podcast as well in the past. He wrote, he's written several great books, but he talked once about mild apostasy versus transformative apostasy, where he said that there are some people who are they're mild apostates. They grew up in families like mine, for instance, that were relatively liberal moderate, even though we were living in Saudi Arabia. My parents were Western educated professors, and when I left, it wasn't really. I didn't really have a traumatic religious upbringing, but so for me, even though I left, I still like some of the cultural elements. Like secular Jews. You have the holidays, and in our case, we have Eid, and we do the Christmas tree too, even though we never grew up Christian or anything. We do the Ramadan, the feast, because there's a lot of great food. I mean, I'm not going to say no to that. We just kind of do it without the religion. On the other hand, and I still, how some people still enjoy art. It's like sort of Christian art, and they Christian many other things like that. In the same way, when I hear the prayer call, it still sounds alluring to me. Like it sounds peaceful and calming, even though I know that it doesn't really mean anything.
Right.
On the other hand, you talk to somebody like Yasmin, right, who came from a very fundamentalist background, much like your own, fundamentalist Islamic background, forced to fast, like literally starved by parents, forced to cover up and be modest, abused, physically abused if she didn't. I mean, you know her story. For her, hearing that, a lot of these associations were triggering, right? So many times I would speak about, I still kind of like the Eid holidays because all my family gets together, and I don't know specifically about Eid, and I don't want to speak for her on that, but in a similar kind of vein, she would think, well, I had it good, I was privileged, which is true. I was compared to what she went through. Right. So hers would be more transformative apostasy, where people, these people, they wouldn't want to have anything to do with it. Like even the slightest reminder of it can often trigger them really badly. So there is, I think I'm just going to say one more thing. I feel like there's two elements of this. One is the sort of what you talked about, which was the emotional trauma of, suddenly, you've had this moral compass your whole life. Suddenly it's ripped out from under you. And what are you going to do? How are you going to build your identity again? How are you going to build your relationships with your community? And your role as a mother, as a human being, as everything. How do you piece that back together? And then on the other hand, there's questions about, well, I believed in the afterlife, but now what do I do? Is it all gonna, there's what kinds of issues feature most prominently among the people that you've talked to in terms of trauma?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. I find grief work is something that our community really needs to know about and participate in, because there are so many losses when you lose your faith. Especially if you've come out of a fundamentalist background, there are just different aspects of grief and things that we can't mourn what we don't acknowledge. So I have my clients at some point make out a list of all of their losses related to religion. The things they lost when they were in religion, so things they were denied participating in or whatever else it is. And then again, the things that they lost religious trauma syndrome is. It encompasses those losses, the losses suffered in the religion, and then the losses suffered when you leave. And so I do, with my clients, spend time going through grief and the grieving process, and then we can release some of that energy. And anger is part of grief also. It's a very legitimate part of grief, but we don't want to get stuck in that angry place. There's anger that can be self-annihilating and immolating, and it'll just take down everything in its path. And then there's anger, to use your word, anger that can be transformative, that can spur us on to make different choices and become different people. So I think addressing grief is a very significant part of recovering from religion. Very much about taking back our power, because it is somewhat disempowering to be religious, to believe that there is a supreme being somewhere who's orchestrating everything. And this is why I also do not send my clients who are struggling with addiction. I never send them to AA. I don't send them to 12-step programs. I send them to a SMART recovery, SMART, because I don't want them thinking that the responsibility or the power lies anywhere else outside of them. They are capable and they can do it. And so taking back our power is an important part of recovery when we've had religious trauma too.
Mm-hmm. And what you're referring to with the AA thing is that if you go to Alcoholics Anonymous, then their 12-step program is very, very rooted in Christianity, right? Yep. It's about recognizing a higher power and all of that. And that can be it can kind of counter the idea of actually empowering yourself.
Yes. And it's very disturbing to me that so many recovery programs are actually run by churches, because I see that as people swapping one addiction for another. They're swapping their addiction to a substance. They're swapping that out for an addiction to religion. Yeah.
So there's this other aspect of it. So what we see here, what we see in, for example, with Muslims, so young Muslims who leave Islam, it is a different experience for many of them. I have seen that initially, especially with Muslims who have been, because a lot of times these kids, they get, it's heartbreaking. They get disowned by their families. So just the idea of, freeing yourself from this ideology, or just saying that, okay, I want to think differently about things. I'm changing my mind about this one sort of belief system. That decision of just changing your mind, asking questions or having doubts, is loaded, with the burden of losing your family, losing your childhood friends, losing the community you grew up in, all your childhood memories, not being able to go back to the neighborhood that you grew up in a lot of cases, because many of us who are here, I can't travel back to Pakistan where I grew up, or to Saudi Arabia especially. Even though there are times that I want to, you have associations with the places you grew up in, right? You don't want to lose them.
Well, and it's terrifying to think that you could lose your life. You could lose your life because you have decided to think for yourself. I am tremendously burdened for people who have the fortitude to walk away from Islam. It's such a courageous thing to do. And I really feel that we need to be able to somehow provide a lot more support for people who are in this situation.
Yeah, I agree with you. And this is, what I wrote in my book is, this is one of those situations where changing your mind can mean losing your head, quite literally. There are people, I have, we have friends like Raif Badawi, he's in jail. He's a blogger in jail in Saudi Arabia, and he hasn't seen his kids for coming on 8 years now.
Wow.
So it's just the kind of things that people go through are horrific, because I have to do this. But that's why it's such a big decision. And I feel, I see this especially online from, when the new atheism movement first came out, there was this idea that this is true, this is not. We're talking about rationality. We got to think about it from a rational perspective. If you don't believe in it, why do you want to keep parts of it with you? Just let the whole thing go. It's so easy. And those people don't understand the costs. They don't understand that it really is like leaving your life behind, and you're not just building a new life and building a new, you have to figure out what to do with your career. You have to figure out what are you going to do with the children who've been raised a certain way.
Yeah.
I mean, we had, Ron Miscavige,
Yes.
is the father of David Miscavige.
Yes.
David Miscavige is the head of the Church of Scientology, right? He's a guy who was always hanging out with Tom Cruise.
Yeah.
His dad actually got the whole family into Scientology.
Wow.
And then he left. So he left the church. And his son's still leading it. And we had an amazing conversation with him, actually. He was on the show as well. Yasmin was also on that. She was one of the people we all interviewed him together. But you just see this. People go through so much. There's such a high cost of letting go, and it's just not as simple as changing your mind.
Yeah, well, and particularly when it's also cultural, like you were just describing. So I mean, right. I left Christianity, and I lost my Christian friends, but I didn't, I could still get a job, these sorts of things. But when it is a part of your cultural heritage, I think it just makes it so much stickier.
Yeah, it is. It's a much bigger challenge. And have you had clients or patients who are from Muslim backgrounds as well?
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, I hope you do now, because I think that a lot of there's this thing. I think people from Muslim backgrounds who think that, okay, well, if you're from a Christian thing, living in Canada, you may not understand, but I think hearing your story and hearing what you went through and the way that you grew up, I think there's so many parallels. And I would encourage people who are listening to this, who want to talk. Obviously, they're going to be in other places. Do you do online?
I do. All of my counseling work pretty much at this point is online. And I do have clients across North America and the United Kingdom as well. So my hours are pretty flexible, and I have a Facebook group called the Divorcing Religion group, and it's a private group. People can ask to join it, and I do have one or two former Muslims in that group, and people from all different backgrounds. But I want to hear from people who've left Islam. I want to be able to learn from them and support them however I can. We do have some similarities for sure, and the pain. Yeah. The pain is the same, the pain of loss, the pain of having to start over.
Yeah, there's this phenomenon, and your website here, I want to say, is Panorama Counseling.
That's right.
That's counseling with 2 L's, so PANORAMA, COUNSELLING.com. So Panorama Counseling. You can go to that if you're interested in potentially reaching out to Janice. There's a sociological phenomenon called anomie. This is something that I heard. I mean, I read about. I also kind of wrote about in the book as well. Is where there's a bit of a pendulum swing. So you're raised very, very fundamentalist, and then when you break out of it, then often, like for example, with Muslims. I've known like ex-Muslims who had just left a really repressive kind of household and family, and suddenly everything they're eating has bacon on it.
Right.
And they are just the alcohol is off the charts. Yeah. If they're if they grew up in a sort of a modesty culture environment where they have to wear the niqab and everything,
they got the shortest
love the women.
Yeah.
Oh, they're doing it. They become very, very promiscuous, and it's an exploration that isn't always necessarily healthy in the sense that it's not healthy to eat bacon with every meal, right. But it's healthy in the sense that I think, how you said that there was a gradual thing. You go to the more progressive side, and then you try to you explore other things, and eventually that's how you rebuild your identity. So have you experienced that with any of your clients? And
I experienced it with myself. I sure did. When I say my kids had a front row seat to the gong show, that was my religious deconversion. I mean, they saw me. It's I liken it to holding a beach ball under the water. for too long. When you take your hands
Right.
off, that thing flies up in the air, water sprays everywhere. Or maybe having a corset that's too tight and you're busting out of your corset. That's what it felt like for me. And of course, my husband that I was married to, he didn't become a religious person until he was in his late teens. And so like my parents didn't until they were in their 20s. So their personalities had an opportunity to develop
Yeah.
outside of religion. Mine did not. And so really, when I divorced religion, I told myself nothing was going to be off limits, and just about nothing was. So I'm glad that I am healthy, that I didn't get arrested. I definitely engaged in some pretty risky and risque behaviors. And it's like you say, I had to go all the way to the other end of the spectrum and almost get a taste of what I didn't like, see what it would be like to live in the gutter, and say, no, I'm worth more than that. Okay, I've tasted enough of that. I'm always now aiming for that elusive middle. I'm always looking for that middle ground. But, a lot of people are able to leave religious fundamentalism, but they can't shake the fundamentalist thinking. And I see this a lot on social media, where then maybe they've left their religion, but now they're trying to tell me how to think and how to talk. And they really, want to come around and spank me for not falling into line. And that can be dangerous and detrimental, very, very harmful to people. And I see it just as there hasn't been a full maturation there. They haven't quite grown up enough yet and got to the point where they realize they're still being fundamentalists.
Yeah, there is I'm so glad you said that. That's a really good point. There is an element of mindset. There are certain mindsets that people have, whether they're religious or not, and it's interesting to see them go through that when they're. So an example actually is my co-host on this show, and again, I don't want to speak for him too much because he'll tear his hair out. Or those of you who know him know that. But Armin was when he was religious, he was. Armin is very, very. He's a stickler for consistency, logical consistency. That's the way his mind works. I mean, this is at least my observation of how his mind works. So when he was religious, he had to make sense of everything. Even though his family wasn't super religious, he became very fundamentalist as a teenager because he was reading the scripture. He's like, you guys told me this is the word of God.
Right.
If everything in this is true, this hell thing sounds horrible. Why aren't you all doing everything you possibly can to avoid going to hell?
Wow.
It had to
Kindred
be consistent. Yeah, and his story is if you go to the very first episode of this podcast, you'll hear his story, which is pretty dramatic. And then when he lost the religion and became an atheist, right? Now the same mindset persists, but it just navigates a different a different realm. It's he's in a different field. He's here and he's still a stickler for rationality. I mean, what is one of the differences between me and him? We're both sticklers for rationality, but for him, he's very, very kind of logical and very, very persistent about that. And it's and that's, I think, one of the things I think about is when people do, I guess, go to the other spectrum, at the other end of the spectrum. How do you navigate morality? I mean, your morality has been kind of indoctrinated in you, right? Or
totally
it's just not been. Yeah, it hasn't been allowed to develop. So what you've done is, if you've been indoctrinated in a fundamentalist, Christian faith, Muslim faith, Islamic faith, you grow up with an inherited secondary sense of morality where you're not thinking, is what I'm doing, is this something I'd want to be done to me? Is this the right thing to do? But you're thinking, well, what would God say? Is there a reward for this in heaven? Is there punishment for this in hell? So when that suddenly, after decades and marriage and children, and you're at a point and suddenly all of that stuff is taken away, what do you do? How do you navigate morality? What is your yardstick, your reference point to start with?
Well, I used to have a bracelet that I wore that said WWJD, which was what would Jesus do?
Jesus do, yeah.
Except now it's just what would Janice do?
Well,
and
that's a great coincidence.
Yeah, I feel that worked out well. I still have the bracelet. I guess I really just developed my thinking more along secular humanist lines. So looking at why do I want to do this thing? What's the thing I want to do? Is it going to benefit or harm me? Is it going to benefit or harm other people? Mm-hmm. And those pretty much were the big one I had to grapple with abortion. That was a big one for me to think about. Homosexuality, I had no problem with at all. Nothing at all. It's not an issue. But abortion, I really had to think about and get to know people who supported choice, and find out why, how did they deal with it and why did they think it was okay? So it's a lot of self-education. And then, of course, also afterlife was a big issue for me too. Yeah. And that was probably the hardest one for me to relinquish, was especially having a child whose health is very perilous. So my girls are adults now, but the 21-year-old, we're in the hospital a lot. And I know that she doesn't have the same life expectancy that my other daughter has. And so to think about not getting to spend eternity with her, that's hard. That's pretty challenging. Yeah. But as far as making moral decisions, I feel like if you're a human and you're a decent person, you're going to be capable of making decent decisions. Don't hurt animals, don't hurt people. Mind your own freaking business. You're allowed to. You want people to give you room to be yourself, and that means you have to give other people room to be themselves. I don't spend a lot of time debating people who are still religious because it's fruitless. They have to have their own epiphany, as I had my own, to break through that cognitive dissonance. But in the meantime, I'll thank them not to try and dictate how I live my life.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And the thing that I struggled with the most, me personally, was the afterlife aspect as well. Mm-hmm. And especially I knew, I was in my 20s when I lost my father, and it was we were close, and it was a tough thing to think. You can't force yourself to believe something, right? But it was at that time I wished at times I wish I believed in an afterlife. It would be very comforting for me to believe it. And it's a really tough one that I think I actually feel like that is the one thing that us in the secular rational atheist community don't talk about enough. I think we just kind of say, well, you're going to be in the ground. That's it. That's how it's going to happen. Right. And as true as that might be, or not, I don't, nobody knows anything, but it's just, I think of it. I like to think of ways to speak to people who are looking for that comfort.
You might like another one of our speakers coming to court is named Dave Warnock. And Dave is, he was a pastor for decades. He's now an atheist, and he's dying of ALS, of Lou Gehrig's disease. And he has launched a tour, which he calls Dying Out Loud. And he is traveling all over the world, talking to groups about what it's like to be dying and to be facing death as an atheist, as someone who had before really firmly believed in the afterlife. And boy, talk about the rubber meeting the road. And he is just delightful. He is very funny. Of course, it's pretty dark humor at this point.
Of course,
When we're talking
of
about death,
course.
but he's so refreshing, and I'm really glad that he can come because, as you say, it's a topic that we need to talk about. It's like one of the last taboo topic that we don't tend to talk about is death, but it's so natural, and we've sanitized it to such a degree. We don't even want our children attending funerals, and we don't even call it a funeral. We just call it a celebration of life. You know, we have to be
Sorry,
allowed
Janice,
to.
I think you.
Oh,
Sorry, I think you froze for a second on my
okay.
side. So just in case, can you just repeat the last part of what you said?
Sure. Let's see. Oh, that we have, to a degree, sanitized death and dying in North America, such that we don't even want our children to attend funerals because we think it would be too much for them, or we don't even call it a funeral anymore. We just call it a celebration of life. But there's actually value in seeing the body in the coffin, feeling the cold body, recognizing, I mean, you're still honoring the life that that person had, but you are saying this person is not here anymore. And as a Christian, we were told we went to a funeral, we don't grieve as the world grieves. That's what they would say all the time. We don't mourn as the world mourns because we're all going to be in heaven anyway. So dry your tears. And that completely invalidates and halts the grieving process right there. When you're told that you can't even grieve, you have to grieve.
Yeah, but that's a power that they have. I think with religion, one of the powers that it has, like my aunt and her daughters, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of comfort that comes into it. And I talk to people about it. I think I'm like, well, 13.8 billion years since the Big Bang, I wasn't there. They discovered oil in the desert. They landed on the moon. Kennedy died. All these things happened. I had no idea it didn't affect me. And after I die, it'll be the same thing. I wouldn't be there to know that I don't exist. To me, that's comforting. But it took a while for me to find more comfort in that than the idea of heaven and hell. There's also just there's so many ways in which I've thought about it. And I think that's a separate topic, and I think we might do another episode on this. But sorry, what was the name of the man that you spoke about?
Dave Warnock, and his tour is called Dying Out Loud.
Dying Out Loud.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we need a lot more of that, because this is by far one of the most common questions that I get from people who are religious. That well, what are you going to do? What's going to happen after you die? And it's a tough one. I mean, does that come up in your practice at all?
Yes, it does, and particularly for people, pardon me, who have lost someone dear to them. And I've never been dead. I can't, and nobody else really can say what exactly happens after, but we can kind of extrapolate. And if you think that the Bible is a collection of myths rather than something truthful, yes, people need to think about these things and to be able to talk about them. And we do have another doctor who is an expert in grief and grieving. She's going to be coming to the conference, and she's talking about how toxic theology leads to complicated grief. And
yes,
it really does. Yeah.
This sounds like an absolutely phenomenal conference. That it's just the theme for it is fantastic, and I really, really hope everyone who can make it out there makes it out there. I wanted to ask you two more questions. I know we're
Sure.
over an hour now, but but there's so many. Again, I have so many things to talk to you about. This always happens. First of all, you mentioned, because we're talking about dying and so on, but you mentioned your view on abortion, and you said same-sex marriage is not something that you had a problem with. So I agree with that. I think that there's no secular argument against same-sex marriage. It doesn't make sense. I think it's it's just consensual adults. There's really no suffering, no harm done to anybody. I have struggled with the abortion question. I mean, I'm pro-choice. That's where I've landed eventually. But I don't think it's as easy a question as same-sex marriage. I mean, there are many secular groups that talk about abortion as a difficult issue. For me, it's clear. I think that there's, you can't force human beings to give birth. You just can't do that. You know, you can't tell them what to do with their bodies. But at the same time, I do respect the argument, even if I don't agree with it. I do respect the argument of the pro-life side, who argue that, I mean, if you're looking at it from a libertarian perspective, and you consider a fetus or an embryo to be a human being, right, then that human being has rights as well, and to kill that human being would be considered murder from their point of view. I don't agree with it, but I get where it's coming from. So you having been on, I don't know, are you pro-choice now, or?
Yes, yeah, absolutely pro-choice. But I understand the struggle.
Yeah, I mean, having been, I guess I was wondering, having been on the other side of the argument, on the pro-life side, and now being pro-choice, and acknowledging that you struggled with that transition. Is there anything specific or any argument that you found particularly compelling that brought you to the pro-choice side?
For me, it was partly embracing feminism, which certainly I had never been part of my life. And even now, at the weirdest times, I'll suddenly feel like, oh, I have to be quiet, or I should be submissive, or I really shouldn't say that, or I'll let the man eat first, or whatever the thing is, right? And so part of it involves still growing and shaking myself, trying to shake myself free of those beliefs that were just thrust upon me and fed to me for my whole life. And once I started looking at the unfairness of a female, just because she's a female, being forced to carry essentially a parasite, because your babies live off you while they're growing, right? In that sense, right? And I have children.
No, they're parasites well after birth. They continue to be parasites. That doesn't change.
Draining the bank account. So part of it was my own growth as a female human, and actually my partner, and I am bisexual quite happily, and I explored that after my divorce as well. My partner currently is a male, and he's a Jew. He's a Reformed Jew, and he is like the strongest feminist I've ever met. He is so egalitarian. It is hilarious. Like, I went with him one time to his synagogue, and they're all reading out of this same book that they have. And every time they're saying God, he's yelling out, she. You're gonna get us kicked out. You're gonna get us kicked out. But he's been a really big help to me as well, and just embracing the person that I am, and that I'm allowed to be free and think my own thoughts, and that's what I do. Yeah,
no, that's and it's just so it is really interesting to ask these questions. And finally, so you mentioned the gentleman with the dark humor, who's touring the Dying Out Loud, and we mentioned at the start of this that you also dabble in comedy. As we know, is one of the most it's just a great way to deal with so many different things. Have you, I guess, both personally in your life and in your practice as well, do you see the value, and being somebody who enjoys comedy and does comedy herself, what is the value of humor when it comes to dealing with difficult questions like this, or dealing with religion, or criticizing religion? Right. Where do you put humor in your life? What role does it have?
I would say it is so important, and it really is one of the hallmarks of maturity. We have to be able to laugh at ourselves. And there's this, old quote from the Roman times or the Greek times or something, and it says, life is a tragedy for those that feel and a comedy for those that think. And I agree with that. Yeah. I can totally relate to that. And I think humor is just a wonderful, healthy way for us to cope sometimes. And also for me, one thing we share a lot of in my online group, the Divorcing Religion group on Facebook, a lot of memes, religious memes, things that we would have found sacrilegious before. And now we look at them and tears are coming down the cheeks because we're laughing and going, I can't believe I bought into that so wholeheartedly. Of course, this aspect or that aspect is ridiculous. We have to be able to poke fun at ourselves sometimes and at some sacred cows too. Yeah. So I find humor very important.
Yeah, and your friend Courtney Hurd, who was on the last episode of this podcast, I mean, she's like a meme machine. I mean, the stuff that she has. I know, I'm always like taking screenshots of everything she posts, and I'm sending it to people. It's just absolutely hilarious. Do you do stand up, or do you perform at all?
I do sit down. If you watch the Georgian Glow videos, you see that I was pretty much sitting down most of the time. I sometimes attend stand-up. I've never done stand-up myself. The humor I prefer definitely is witty humor. I'm not a real fan of vulgar humor. I just don't find that really funny. Some people do. But if I find a comic that just is tickling my funny bone, really they're understanding humanity and how humanity works and how ridiculous we are, that's my favorite type.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you. This is for me, a lot of this, when I was having doubts about religion, and one of the things that really got me going is I just found out really early on that within my family, even within my Muslim family and so on, before I actually told them I was an atheist, I found that if I joked about it, it got the message through in a way that it wouldn't if I had a serious discussion about it. You could get away with so much. And I would listen to, I listened to George Carlin a lot, and George Carlin was one of the first. He was just brutal. He was he would skewer religion in front of religious audiences.
He was forbidden in our house.
Yeah, and he would, people would be laughing their asses off. And I had the honor of meeting his daughter, Kelly Carlin, who does show up at a lot of his conferences. So, and she's great too. There's just, and there's so many different comedians. I think with stand-up comedy, atheism has always been. Ricky Gervais is another one.
Oh my God.
So these are. It's so good to have these people, as Bill Maher and so on, like just out there and doing it in a way that everybody kind of gets and that's sort of accepted.
Yes, and also because if you were raised in a fundamentalist home, like if you were indoctrinated from childhood, your personality was hijacked, and your sense of fun was probably smashed out of you and replaced with a sense of duty and responsibility. Like there was not a lot of laughter in my house when I was growing up. So I had to be about my father's business. That means always with a heavenly mind, looking at who could I witness to. And so there wasn't a lot of fun. And I think that's one reason, I'll just say it, that I really enjoy doing mushrooms, because they make me laugh my ass off. I just there's so much laughter in there that still has to come out from all those decades of suppressing it. So I really go the extra mile trying to make myself laugh and trying to make other people laugh sometimes too.
That's great. Well, I just keep laughing and keep being funny and keep doing everything that you're doing. I think that just all of the stuff you're doing, whether it's the counseling or the humor or the comedy, telling your story, the conference that you're doing, all of these things are just, I'm already a huge fan. So, thank you very much for coming on. I'm going to, again, the online Divorcing Religion workshop is divorcingreligion.com. The conference with, oh wow, everybody's, you're there, Nate Phelps is there, Yasmin Mohammed's there. It's Court 2020. Excuse me. CORT2020.com, and your counseling website is panoramacounseling.com with 2 L's.
Yes.
And you are on Twitter. Can you tell everybody your Twitter handle so they can find you?
Sure. I'm on Twitter. I have 2 accounts. One is @divorcereligion, and the other one is @wise_counselor. The counselor has 2 L's. And I'd also like to tell you that we are happy to give a discount to any of your listeners who want to attend the conference. I'm going to give you a code that you can pass along to them, and they'll get $60 off a ticket for regular ticket price.
That is a good deal. So everybody, everyone who's listening to this, you heard it. You get $60 off of the ticket price for the Court 2020 conference. And just get in touch and just reach out and let us know. Well, for those of you who don't know, you can reach us at secularjihadists@gmail.com. We're there. You can also just go to secularjihadist.com or patreon.com/secularjihadists. And you can support us for as little as $1 a month. If you can't pay, that's perfectly fine. Share the episodes on your social media timeline. Give us an iTunes review. Everything helps. Thanks to everybody who's listening. Do consider signing up as a patron. And thank you so much, Janice, for coming on again.
What a pleasure. It's just been a delight. Thank you so much. I hope you do come to the conference. I'd love to meet you in person.
Yeah, no, I'm going to.
Yay!
I'm going to. It's in April. Yeah, absolutely.
You get $60 off.
Yeah, I know. I got it. So we're going to post all of this information. It's in the description. If you're listening to this on audio, just whenever you go, just look in the description. All the links and everything are there for it. Okay. All right, Janice. Thank you very much. And thanks. And thanks, everybody.
The secular jihadists have been made possible thanks to the Illuminati and the covert support of Israel and the CIA. That's what we have been told, but we haven't received our checks yet. If you like what we do, please support us. Share the podcast with your friends. Write and tweet us with topic and guest suggestions. Or head over to secularjihadist.com and give $1 or more for exclusive access to live video. Have your questions read and answered on the air, and more. Till next time, may the flying spaghetti monster be with you.